back and know what I've talked about, because this is one of the things I want to try thinking about. So let me share my screen if that's okay. And let me go to this. I'm not going to have a lot of slides, but I am going to show you this gentleman for just a second. Let me suggest what we're going to do, what I want to do for a while. This is really not about Charles I. I'm going to talk a little bit about him. But this is really more a reflection on historians and the task of being a historian. So that's really what it is. So the format's going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to try and keep it reasonable and give us some time for some questions. But I really want to present what I think is the issue. And the issue is, well, you'll see. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing these slides fairly quickly, and because it's the slides, I don't want them to be a distraction. But so this is the man, King Charles I. He's the British monarch, the ruler of Scotland and England, who has become the most crucial for me to understand. And I find that a bit surprising, because when you hear about work on the Scottish witch hunt, you would naturally, I think, assume that I would be more interested in King James VI of Scotland, who of course becomes in 1603 James I of England. And you would not be alone. Everyone thinks he's the monarch associated with the witch hunts. Except if you look on this graph, what you will notice is that you probably can see 1621, right in the middle of that decade, that's when Charles I comes to power. And he goes, he's killed in 1649, he's executed. And then you have the civil wars, and then his son comes to power in 1661-62. So most of the Scottish witch hunt occurs either during his reign or after his execution and before power is reestablished. So that's something that most people don't even think about. And as a social historian, one of the things I've had to try to figure out is why? What's going on here? And particularly 3 years into his reign, seemingly out of the blue, we have a major outbreak of witch hunting in Scotland that then continues. So what's going on? So that's why I've ended up spending the time I have trying to think about King Charles I. And some of you will know this is Greyfriars Churchyard, where the National Covenant was signed. And I am now going to stop sharing the screen and just talk, just so you, but that's what I've been trying to figure out. And there's a lot of things about Charles that you can say, and I'm going to go with the traditional historiography and just say most of them are negative. He was incompetent, he was untrustworthy, he was stubborn, he didn't understand his subjects. I've been known to summarize this when teaching and simply say Charles I was an idiot. Stark though it may seem, I think that's not an unreasonable judgment. And of course, like all judgments in history, there's another side. But when we look at what happens in his reign, it really is quite remarkable. But saying that doesn't help me really to understand him or his reign. And I've come to realize the thing that puzzles me most is how long he was in power before the crisis actually emerged. Charles was all of those things in 1625 when he took the throne. The piece of legislation which drove the Scots into rebellion, the Act of Revocation, the thing that everybody talks about, how it alienated the Scots, that's at the very beginning of his reign. And yet the Scots did revolt, but that didn't explode until 1637, and then organized itself around the National Covenant, which was signed where we saw in Greyfriars in 1638. In England, again, everyone talks about how he alienated his subjects, but it took even longer, not until the early 1640s, despite the fact that everyone always talks about the grievances that were long-standing. So that's the question that I have. Like, why did it take so long? Everyone talks about how alienated everyone was, but why didn't this revolt happened in 1626 or 1627. So that's one of the things that I've been struck about. And even then, despite all of his obvious failures as a monarch, he continued to have support. Supporters throughout the civil wars in both Scotland and England. And indeed, James Graham, the Marquis of Montrose, switched from being opposed to the king and returning to loyalty. And so you can see that there's a cluster of questions which emerge. And I've never really been able to get my head around them, except now I think I'm beginning to understand it. And the thing that has changed has not been all of the things that we normally would say. I haven't read this new biography of Charles I that's changed my mind. There's been no discovery of key documents or some new insight. What's given me a greater understanding of Charles I is actually what's happening in contemporary politics in our world today. And it's as I look out at those things, what's reported in the TV and on the internet and the media, that I'm beginning to gain greater insight into Charles I and how he managed to stay in power. Now, this isn't supposed to happen. Historians, we are told, deal with the past. They're to be objective, we're again told. They're to be, kind of just brains and not influenced by things. At least that's the idea. And we have a legitimate suspicion about reading the present into the past. And that should be something we're very, very cautious about. But the reality is, there's always a dialogue between the situation in which the historian herself or himself lives and the past. Whether we want to or not, we make judgments based on what we are going through and experience. We ask questions, we explore topics, we interpret events, all at least with some influence from the world right around us in which we're living. That's almost inevitable. Let me give you an example. And again, I'm going to use some of my own research, some of the stuff I know fairly well. So the European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th century. In the English-speaking world, Salem is probably the most famous witch hunt. And yet most of us, and I actually include myself in here, even with all the books that I've read on Salem, I still really see the Salem witch hunt through the eyes of Arthur Miller and his incredible play, The Crucible. That really has shaped it. The lens was one of a runaway prosecution based upon fear, not reality. Salem became a parable for what Miller was seeing happening in the United States in his own time during the Red Scare we now know as McCarthyism. And so he saw events in the late 17th century as an example of persecution. And that continues to be the lens through which we see events, not only in Salem, but also elsewhere in Europe. And so historians have focused on those things: false confessions, torture, asking people to name names and accuse others. They focused on those elements which lead to persecution, and to witch hunts. That is an intentional attempt to seek out and uncover a conspiracy, the breakdown of fair judicial procedures, the expansion of cases as one person accuses another, all of those things. That's what we think of when we think of a witch hunt. And that's a fairly good analysis of America in the late 1940s and early 1950s during McCarthyism. And it may actually fit what happened in Salem. But it doesn't help us in situations where there's only one accused witch and everyone's fine with that. And that's one of the most interesting things. That's a very common feature of what we call the European witch hunts. There's no hunt. Someone's accused as a witch, they're executed as a witch, people go on. There isn't all of that stuff that we find in Salem that we understand as the witch hunt. And so it's kind of a complexity, and it's an example, I think, of how when we started looking at those events, we took our own experience and imagined the past and saw things that were there that might fit, but we might have missed other things. And one question that I have myself is, what would happen if we started looking at the Salem witch hunt today, not 60 years ago? And I think what would surprise us about the situation in Salem, Massachusetts, and where we would find parallels with our own time and what we might emphasize, is the community divisions, the partisanship in Salem. That might be what we focus on, because that's in our time, and we might read that into the past. So what I'm suggesting is that the experience of McCarthyism was an experience which influenced how playwrights and historians understood the 16th and 17th century. This happens all the time. There may be also no way to avoid it. As already briefly noted, historians are often afraid of this, of reading the present into the past, and we do need to be cautious. We need to think carefully about how we use the past, how we interpret it. So I agree, we need to be really cautious and very careful about this. But I also think we need to recognize that we do it, sometimes without realizing it. We just assume that's what reality is. What I believe we as historians need to be is more aware of this and more transparent. We might also consider it at times as a possible tool in our toolbox that we can use appropriately, not all the time, but there might be some time where we might want to pull it out and use it cautiously and sparingly. Let me use a different example of how we've understood the past in light of our situation. And the example I want to use is a crucial one in the 20th century, and that's the whole historiography, the whole way of writing history that deals with the rise of fascism in Europe. And there's been a tendency in the English-speaking world over the last 50 years, maybe even longer, there's been a tendency to say, well, it didn't happen here. It didn't happen in England. It didn't happen in Canada. It didn't happen in the United Kingdom. And where fascism did happen, or it's Germany, German variant Nazism, where it won power, it wasn't in any of those places. It was these other countries. And so we've often wondered if there was something in Italy or in Germany that made them more susceptible to fascism and authoritarianism. And there may have been. But I just want to note, the historians making that interpretation were influenced by where they sat, by their historical circumstances. And when we look back, even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, one of the things that's fascinating about North America is how vibrant the democracy was, with a surprising amount of actually broad consensus. There was disagreement, but broad consensus on many issues, and a respect for institutions, and also a surprising amount of social mobility, that people were going up and down the social scale, well, even in the UK, but definitely here in Canada and the United States. That's changed, as we know, and it's changing. And so I suspect the events of the last decade are going to appropriately raise questions about what we've understood to be specifically a problem of Italy or Germany. And here I'm thinking about Boris Johnson coming to power in the UK. And the ways he's been able to manipulate things, the way he's been able to use the media in order to gain power. And I'm just wondering, is it easier now to understand Mussolini, having looked at Johnson? And that's where I'm thinking it can be a tool if we're careful, if we're conscious and self-conscious about it. And so I think we are doing this, and I think we just need to be conscious about it and think about it. And I wonder if at times it's not even a good thing to go, hey, this is what I'm seeing here today. Does this help me understand something I've been struggling with in the past? Is there something here that's useful, that gives insight? And if there is, test it and see if that works for us. And here I want to circle back in my final few minutes, and I want to circle back to Charles I. I've already outlined what I find fascinating about Charles I. It's how long it took for the serious issues to break out into revolt and how he maintained support. Do we see any parallels, any similar situations in our world today? Well, I think sadly we see so in many countries. So we might use Russia as an example. We might use England as an example. But with apologies, I'm going to talk about the United States for a while. I'm going to be very direct. Americans believe in their system. They believe in the office of president. And when the president speaks, he must be taken seriously. When the president lies, well, what do? We see this unfold before our eyes on a daily basis. For a series of reasons that historians 100 years from now will set out, someone unfit for office became president. Once in office, he's violated most of the norms of what recent presidents have done. He's lied, he's failed to do his job, he's demonstrated in countless ways before the pandemic hit some really serious issues. And here's where I see the parallel with Charles I. It's the office that is hard to challenge, even if the person in it is acting out in ways that seem inappropriate or that in any other circumstance would be unacceptable. If God has ordained the office of American president, as he clearly has, how can anyone unfit for office attain that office? It's impossible. The office then protects the person in a particular way. Even when there's a transparent falsehood, you have to take what that person says seriously. You can't call them out in the way you would call out almost anyone else. And if God has ordained the king and placed the monarch over us, as he clearly has, how can anyone unfit be king? Let me say clearly, I've been looking at Charles and not seeing that. I just hadn't got that. I couldn't figure out why people put up with them. And as I think back on that, I realize, again, it's this whole thing of not being conscious about your own situation. How privileged I was as a late 20th century, early 21st century Canadian, where it's no big deal to challenge the prime minister or anyone in office, or even the queen as the head of state. You can be an anti-monarchist in Canada. It's all cool, like no one cares. Well, I have one Facebook friend who cares, but that's about it. Most people don't really matter. And I missed how different it was. I missed that the office gave him a weight that I wasn't taking seriously, and allowed him to do things that Brian Mulroney or Jean Chrétien in Canada could never have got away with. So I realize I have to start thinking differently. I have to be conscious about how I am understanding things in the past, and at times even look at some new insights from contemporary developments. They may even be helpful. It's the office of monarch, I think, as I suggest, that limits what people can say about Charles I. That may be what delays what you and I would think would be the natural course of events, which is to oppose the king. Another insight, there are people who support others in power, not those who try to turn the president or the king to take more appropriate actions. We had some really fine people in the early days of Trump's presidency. I might not agree with them on policy, but I think there were people of great character who did try to temper his actions. But it's hard to say that today. And particularly, there seem to be people who are not doing anything to restrain the power of a powerful individual. And again, how does that help us understand somebody in the past? And here I'm thinking specifically of Attorney General William Barr. For whatever reasons, personal ambition or ideological belief in an imperial presidency, William Barr has taken and continues to take actions that are quite serious. He has misrepresented what Robert Mueller found in the Mueller report, and he trusted people that people wouldn't bother to read it, and he's been largely proven correct. But his characterization of what Robert Mueller found is completely false. There were attempts by those trying to get Donald Trump elected president to obtain the support of foreign agents to assist in that happening, the Russians. They just weren't very good at it, so it didn't come up as a conspiracy. That being said, the evidence of Russian interference was detailed and overwhelming in that report. There were also, in the second part, grounds for impeaching the president. Not all the charges made. Mueller was just really fair and laying it all out. But when he presented the report, William Barr simply said, "There's nothing here," which is not true. And since then, he's worked to undermine and discredit all of those involved in trying to bring a threat to democracy to light. And so what I've learned from this is even incompetent, there are people who enable things to go on. And this has made me, as a historian, interested in the question of who were the people around Charles I? Who were the people who enabled him and supported him? And what were they trying to do? And I think that's given me an insight into something I want to think more about, is why were people, who were they, and for what reasons were they acting to support Charles? And that is something I find really interesting. Do we have these characters who are trying to temper the president or the king? Do we have people who were just trying to advance their career? It has raised all kinds of really interesting questions that, as I said, 10 years ago, when I was looking at Charles I, these were not the questions I was considering. So to conclude, I've used Charles I as an example to try to raise for us an issue which I believe historians have to take more seriously, namely how our situation, our time, our values influence how we look at and interpret the past. And while I agree that we need to use caution and not read the present into the past, I also believe it is true that we are unconsciously affected by our own situation. We need to be more aware of this. And I also wonder if there aren't sometimes in some situations where very carefully we might use some insights to help us understand what we're seeing in another century. And so that's what I just wanted to talk about. It seems to me there's a constant dialogue, not only with the documents, but with the situation in which the historian finds herself or himself. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And that's the end of that part. And so let's talk.